Whenever the Inventory tab is selected, it will show this inventory cover sheet that provides simple instructions on how to estimate emissions using the 6 inventory sheets for all 6 sectors of the GPC. These instructions are clearly laid out step by step from instruction numbers 1 to 19, and at the base of the sheet there are interactive icons that, when clicked, go directly to any of the 6 GPC sectors. In this video, we are looking at the stationary energy sector. Stationary energy sources are one of the largest contributors to a city's GHG emissions. There are 8 tables in the stationary sheet to record the emissions from all these different subsectors. Residential buildings, commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, manufacturing industries and construction, energy industries, agriculture, forestry and fishing activities, non-specified sources, fugitive emissions from mining, processing, storage and transportation of coal, and fugitive emissions from oil and natural gas systems. For full details of what to report in each table, refer to Part 2 of the CIRIS User Guide or Chapter 6 of the GPC. The number of columns and column headers are the same for all of the tables in this sheet. Note that the title rows in each of the tables divide it into scopes with corresponding GPC reference numbers, and this is colour-coded in line with the GPC requirements for a basic inventory in green and Basic Plus in blue. For a basic inventory, cities shall report all GHG emissions from stationary energy sources and fugitive emissions in Scope 1, and those from the use of grid-supplied electricity, steam, heating and cooling in Scope 2. For a Basic Plus inventory, cities shall report all basic sources and Scope 3 GHG emissions associated with transmission and distribution (T&D) losses from grid-supplied electricity, steam, heating and cooling. Emissions from energy generation supplied to the grid shall be reported as part of total Scope 1 emissions, but not included in Basic or Basic Plus totals. This information appears in row 1.4.4. This is for reporting of any energy generation within the city that is supplied to the grid. This data is not included within the inventory totals reported, but must be included for transparency and forms part of the territorial inventory. For more information on this, please see section 4.1 of the GPC. As an example of how to complete one of these 8 tables, let's take a look at how to get started with completing the residential buildings table. Firstly, let's add a row to the Emissions from Fuel Combustion Within the City Boundary title row, as we are going to enter a Scope 1 emissions source. Once we've got our row, let's start completing the GHG emissions source columns by reporting emissions from the use of natural gas in residential buildings. First, we will select natural gas in the activity column and add a description of this source. Next, let's add the activity data, which we are going to say in this case is 50 million as our amount, and select kilowatt hour as the unit our data is provided in. Moving across, we will specify that all 3 gases are relevant and are being reported for this fuel, so we'll select CO2, CH4, N2O from the gases column. Note that for most activities we report in a GHG inventory, these 3 gases are relevant and are required to be reported. Then we can select our emission factor. You will remember in the setup video, we added an emission factor for natural gas, so we can use this here for our calculation. Selecting the drop-down, we can select EF_natural gas_residential from the list, and these factors are added to the table. Notice now that the emission factor unit per tonnes of CO2 equivalent is also displayed in the units column. It is really important to check that the activity data unit matches the unit of the denominator of the emission factor. If they don't, we can use the Activity Data Unit Converter cells to convert activity data into the same units as the emission factor. The Activity Data Multiplier uses pre-populated conversion factors that we saw in the introduction video, which convert our activity data into the same unit as the emission factor. To make this conversion, in the Activity Data Unit Converter, we can select TJ, terajoule, in EF unit, as this is our emission factor unit, and we can see that a value has now appeared in the default column. CIRIS will use this conversion factor to convert the activity data in kilowatt hours into terajoules in the emission calculation. In some instances, the message "not available" will appear if there is no built-in conversion factor between units. In this instance, please add your own conversion factor to the override column. Moving across the table, there are additional columns that allow you some flexibility in reporting your data. For information on the oxidation factor, please see the CIRIS user guide. If you do not have an emission factor for a specific activity, you may enter emissions data directly. To do so, select the tick in the emissions data column and then manually fill out the columns GHGs metric tons CO2e. Make sure this is reported in metric tons of CO2e. By selecting the tick, CIRIS uses emissions data reported here if there is no data calculated. As we have entered data, CIRIS then calculates emissions based on the data submitted in metric tons of CO2e in the final grey columns. Lastly, we must add the important supporting information on our data and calculation. In the data quality column, we must specify whether our data is of high, medium, or low quality. We should then add a description of the method, including any data processing steps or assumptions made, and lastly select the data source from the list. In this instance, our source is Annual Gas Statistical Report. See the setup video for more details on adding data sources to the Data Sources sheet. The final column allows for any notes and explanations on the data quality. Now that we've finished adding this row, simply repeat this process to add data to the remaining tables. The last step we will demonstrate is how to complete a table where we don't have any activities to report or cannot report them. The introduction video introduced notation keys. If, for example, we cannot separate industrial electricity consumption from commercial and institutional, we can select the notation key IE in the Notation Keys column to ensure the row is not left blank. We must then make sure we add a comment in the description column to say where we are reporting the emissions and why we are reporting them elsewhere. Where there are no activities occurring, we can use the notation key NO for not occurring. Some of the tables have been pre-populated with notation keys and explanations, such as 1.6, as cities rarely have activities to report in these subsectors. If there are emissions to report here, these should be removed. For a quick reminder of which sectors and subsectors are required for Basic and Basic Plus reporting levels for inventories, please refer to the GPC sheet in the Introduction tab.